Donald Trump has wanted to take this island since 1988. Back then it was a hypothetical answer to a newspaper question. This week, standing at a NATO summit while ordering fresh airstrikes on Iran, he said it again. Only now he has bombers in range, a broken ceasefire, and a precedent he's already tested in Venezuela. "We might take over Kharg Island," he told reporters. "There's not a thing they can do about it. I want to break down whether that's actually true, and what taking a 5-mile strip of coral in the Persian Gulf would really mean. Over the next 20 minutes, I'll cover exactly what Kharg Island is, and why it matters so much to Iran's economy, the specific pattern of threats Trump has made against it going back decades, why his own administration has repeatedly drawn up and then shelved plans to actually take it, the Venezuela comparison Trump keeps drawing, and why experts think it doesn't quite apply here, and what Iran has reportedly already done to prepare for exactly this scenario. This isn't really a story about one island, it's a story about how far a threat can be repeated before someone has to decide whether to actually carry it out. Let's start with the basic facts, because the scale here is almost absurdly lopsided. Kharg Island sits about 21 miles off Iran's coast in the northern Persian Gulf, roughly 8 kilometers long and 4 to 5 kilometers wide, about a third the size of Manhattan. Despite that size, it handles approximately 90% of Iran's crude oil exports, close to 950 million barrels a year, according to Al Jazeera, with the deep waters around it allowing massive oil tankers to dock directly. Something most of Iran's shallow coastline can't accommodate. Oil from several offshore fields is piped underwater to Kharg and loaded onto tankers bound overwhelmingly for Asia. With China as the single biggest customer, Iranians call it the Forbidden Island. Access is tightly restricted to those with URG security clearance. The Foundation for Defense of Democracies estimates roughly half of Iran's entire government revenue comes from oil and gas, meaning Kharg isn't just an economic asset. It's close to being the single load-bearing pillar of the Iranian state's finances. That's the scale of what Trump is threatening to take. An 8-square-mile rock that effectively functions as the financial nervous system for the entire Iranian government. Here's what makes this week's comments different from a spontaneous escalation. Trump has been saying almost exactly this for a very long time. In a 1988 interview with The Guardian, discussing a hypothetical future conflict with Iran, he said, "I'd do a number on Kharg Island. I'd go in and take it." Nearly 4 decades later, in the current war, he's repeated versions of the same threat multiple times. On June 11th, he posted on Truth Social, "At some point in the not-too-distant future, we will be taking Kharg Island and other oil infrastructure points and assume total control of their oil and gas markets, much like we have with Venezuela." Hours after that post, he reportedly canceled the threatened strikes, citing ongoing discussions with Iran and oil prices fell. That pattern, escalate the threat, then quietly step back when diplomacy resumes, repeated again this week, on July 8th at the NATO summit in Ankara, following a fresh round of strikes triggered by Iran's attacks on tankers in Hormuz. Trump confirmed Kharg Island itself had been hit overnight, adding, "I said, don't touch the oil. Because maybe we'll take over Kharg Island, and we may take over Kharg Island. There's not a thing they can do about it." Notice that even in the middle of ordering strikes on the island, he specifically instructed forces to avoid the oil infrastructure itself, the same infrastructure he's threatening to eventually seize and control. Here's the part of the story that should temper how seriously you take this specific threat, at least for now. According to CNN reporting, White House officials believe taking Kharg Island would totally bankrupt Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps and could potentially force a swift end to the war, but that same reporting states, plans for a U.S. military operation to capture the island have been drawn up for months and continuously shelved because senior Pentagon officials and administration insiders consider the operation too risky, primarily because seizing and holding it would require a significant deployment of American ground troops onto Iranian soil. Iran hasn't been passive about this possibility either. According to multiple people familiar with US intelligence reporting cited by CNN, in anticipation of a potential American operation, Iran has laid traps around the island and moved additional military personnel and air defenses there, including shoulder-fired, surface-to-air guided missile systems known as manpads on top of the island's already layered defenses. Christian Emery, an associate professor specializing in US-Iran relations at University College London, framed the gamble bluntly. Trump would be betting that Iran's remaining leadership, faced with the loss of tens of billions in annual revenue, would simply capitulate rather than fight for the island. Trump himself has acknowledged the uncertainty, telling Fox News at one point that he wasn't sure America has the stomach to actually take Kharg. Trump keeps reaching for one specific comparison: Venezuela, where the U.S. ousted President Maduro in a January military raid and has since effectively taken control of the country's oil exports, with proceeds deposited into a U.S. Treasury account. It's an evocative parallel for domestic political purposes, but the actual military and geographic realities are substantially different. Kharg Island sits just 21 miles off Iran's mainland, well within range of Iranian short-range missiles and drones, and any American personnel stationed there would be persistently vulnerable, in a way that doesn't map cleanly onto Venezuela's situation. The Council on Foreign Relations has also flagged a second complication that cuts directly against Trump's own stated goals. The Trump administration recently eased sanctions on Iranian oil as part of the broader ceasefire framework, meaning that disrupting or seizing Kharg now would further reduce global oil supply. At a moment when energy markets are already absorbing repeated shocks from this war, Iran's own parliament speaker has warned the country would rain down fire on American forces in response to any such operation. And analysts have pointed to a cluster of other nearby islands, Keshem, Abu Musa, and the Tons, as additional flashpoints that could draw the U.S. into an even wider and more complicated campaign than a single island operation. Put this together and Kharg Island functions less as an imminent military target and more as Trump's go-to maximum pressure signal. A threat he reaches for nearly every time this conflict escalates, precisely because it targets the one asset Iran's government can least afford to lose. The pattern is consistent: escalate rhetoric around Kharg, strike nearby military targets, while explicitly sparing the oil infrastructure itself, then step back once diplomatic. Channels reopen. That pattern held again this week. Strikes on the island's defenses, oil untouched, a public threat repeated for the umpteenth time. Whether that pattern breaks and Trump actually authorizes ground forces onto a heavily defended, missile-range island Iran has spent months preparing to defend remains the open question hanging over this entire war. So here's the question worth sitting with. If Trump has been threatening to take this specific island since 1988, and his own Pentagon has repeatedly drawn up and shelved plans to actually do it, because the risk to American troops is considered too high, what would actually have to change for this threat to move from rhetoric to reality? Because right now, the evidence suggests Kharg Island's real value to Trump isn't as a military objective he's preparing to seize. It's as the biggest, most economically devastating card he can hold over Iran's head without ever actually having to play it.